Friday afternoon, July 12th, 2019 meeting of the Fort Ord Reuse Authority. Let's see, first order of business is the Pledge of Allegiance. Let's see, how about, Councilmember Barron, would you lead us in the pledge? Thank you. All right. Next, we have closed session, and Authority Council will let us know what we're going to be talking about.
Yes, thank you, Chair, members of the board, and public. We're going into closed session this afternoon on item 3A, conference with legal counsel, Government Code Section 54956.9A D1. The case is Marina Community Partners LLC versus Fort Ord Reuse Authority, Monterey County Superior Court case number 18CV871. That's a matter of pending litigation. Item 3B, conference with legal counsel, one item of potential litigation, Government Code Section 54956.9D. And finally C, item C, conference with labor negotiators, Government Code Section 54957.6. The agency designated representatives are Michael Hulamard, Jr., Eduardo Ochoa, and Jane Parker.
Thank you, sir. Is there any member of the public who would like to comment on these closed session items? Seeing none, I'll close public comment, and we will recess to closed session and return as soon as we can. All right, I'm going to reconvene the Friday, July 12th, 2019 meeting of the Fort Ord Reuse Authority. We have emerged from closed session. So, if Authority Council would announce any action taken in closed session.
Thank you, Chair, members of the board and public. The board met in closed session on item 3A, conference with legal counsel, Government Code Section 54956.9A D1, Marina Community Partners LLC versus Fort Ord Reuse Authority, Monterey County Superior Court case number 18CV871. It's a matter of pending litigation. The board heard from legal counsel about the status of the litigation, and there's nothing to report out on that matter. 3B, conference with legal counsel, one item of potential litigation, Government Code Section 54956.9D. The board heard from legal counsel concerning that item of potential litigation. Counsel told the board what the status is and where things are headed, and there's nothing to report out on that item. Item 3C, conference with labor negotiators, Government Code Section 54957.6. The agency designated representatives Michael A. Hulamard, Jr., Dr. Eduardo Ochoa, and Jane Parker. The board heard from the designated representatives of the agency, from the ad hoc committee that has been appointed to review the terms of the executive officer's employment contract, and there will be a discussion during the course of an action likely taken during the course of open session after discussion, and that is my report out on that item.
Thank you. We'll move now to acknowledgments, announcements, and correspondence. Mr. Hulamard.
Yes, Chair Parker, members of the board, I have three very quick items to point out. First, for those of you that didn't see it on the way in, there's one more announcement about the United States Army's tour that's going to be tomorrow morning. You have to meet early tomorrow at 10 a.m. Tour 1 departs from building 4522. So if you want to take a flyer with you, these tours are absolutely wonderful in terms of understanding the full extent of the munitions impact and the history of Fort Ord. Remember your 3 R's. Recognize, retreat, and report. Second, I'd like to mention that the Senate Bill 189 passed the local government committee this week. I think the ayes were 8, the noes were 0. It's been referred to the Appropriations Committee, will probably be heard in August at some point. And then Fort Ord community cleanup outreach efforts I mentioned earlier, and I forgot to mention that there will be an 11:45 a.m. tour if you can't make the 10 o'clock. Chair, that's all I have.
Thank you. Thank you. We will move now to roll call.
Supervisor Parker, Supervisor Phillips, Supervisor Adams, Councilmember Gagliotti, Mayor Pro Tem, I apologize, Councilmember Lisa Berkeley, Mayor Pro Tem Morton, Councilmember Hoffa, Mayor Oglesby, Councilmember Wizard,
Here.
Mayor Carbone, Mayor Gunter, Councilmember Garfield, Councilmember Barron,
Here.
Marina, Nicole Hollingsworth, Erica Parker, Debbie Hale, Dr. Diffenbaugh, Steve Moderazzo, Dr. Ochoa, Colonel Ford, Bill Collins, David Martin, Lisa Reinheiner, and Dr. Zepperman. You have a quorum.
Thank you. And I'd like to just extend a special welcome to Council Member Jeff Barron. I think this is his first attendance at the FORA meeting as sitting at this table. So,
Thank you.
welcome. We'll move now to the consent agenda. So, Heidi, did you want to mention about 7B, or would you like me to do that? Okay.
I can.
Okay.
So
Next.
item 7B, appearing at page 10, had a motion passed on the budget. It's reported as the motion was made by me, Councilmember Morton, and seconded by Hoffa, but in fact, it was Joe Gunter made the motion, and Supervisor Lopez is the second. So with that modification to those minutes, I would move approval of the consent agenda.
All right, thank you. Does any member of the board want to pull any of the items for discussion or question?
Sorry.
That's all right. We're all good. We haven't taken action yet. Any member of the public wishing to ask a question or make a comment on any of the consent agenda items? All right, we do have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. That passes unanimously. All right, we'll move now to the business items. The Delray Oaks Pollution Legal Liability Loan Retirement. This is a second vote.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I would like to request, I'd like to recuse myself from this matter for the record.
Ah, yes. Thank you.
Through the chair?
Yes, Mr. Oglesby, and then Ms. Berkeley, did you have something as well?
If it was appropriate through the chair, I was going to move, because it's the second vote, I was going to move for a motion, but I'll wait for the chair's acknowledgement.
Okay, great.
I just have a question, and I'm wondering, as far as I understand, and I'm wondering if this is correct, that there have been no other cities that have had the possibility of interest being forgiven. Is that correct?
We have had loans in the past to jurisdictions that were non-interest bearing. I don't know that we've ever had an agreement where there was an interest charge and then it was forgiven.
Okay.
I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion? I think it is appropriate probably to make a motion. Mr. Oglesby?
Through the chair, I move the approval of Delray Oaks Pollution Liability Limited Loan Retirement.
Thank you.
Second.
Sure. Okay, we have a second. Whoa. Okay.
So may I ask?
Yes, yes.
So is the
Questions,
maker of the
comment?
motion actually reaffirming the language that was put forth last month and not just the loan? I want to make sure that the terms are included.
Yeah, the second vote has to be on the same terms as the initial vote.
Okay, I just want to make sure that Mr. Oglesby was asking for the same.
Yes, the clerk has a. Yes, I was trying to decide who was, but since Supervisor Phillips had his microphone on, we'll take him.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Gunter can try again
I'm
shortly.
a lot younger anyway. Yeah, so.
Good, so there's a motion and a second. Is there any public comment on this item? All right, I don't think so. So we'll bring it back to this board. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
Yes. No.
Thank you. So we have one no vote. Thank you. And so that motion passes. And we'll go find our abstainer. Great. We'll move now to business item 8B, Executive Officer Contract Amendment. So it looks like we've got our names next to
They
this,
do.
but I think, is there someone who's going to present on this? You're going to maybe present what's being asked
We,
for the public?
as the transition continues of FORA, there has been discussion about the executive officer's employment contract, and specifically how it will how he will carry on through the year, what his timing will be. We have most recently had the chief financial officer, Helen, go down to virtually retirement, although she's been here for meetings, and sometimes she's still here. Robert Norris has retired. Steve Ensley has retired. Sherry Damon has moved on, as well as Ikuyo has also gone to MST, and Jonathan Brinkman to LEFCO. So there has been discussion about Michael's retirement from FORA. Regarding the retirement, while there's nothing specific to announce, there has been a considerable discussion about how FORA would compensate Michael for being here throughout the remainder of this term. That be the remainder of the year, December 31st of 2019. And the executive committee most recently has appointed an ad hoc committee of Jane Parker and Dr. Ochoa. The ad hoc committee has met with Michael to outline certain terms that Michael would have proposed in order to continue through the remainder of this year. And I understand that those terms will be discussed with, and I would be happy to relinquish the microphone now for that discussion, or at least for those terms to be announced, I believe.
Thank you. Maybe Dr. Ochoa, you might spell out what those proposed terms are, if you would.
Certainly.
The terms are that in addition to the current agreement, provision for 5 days of management leave, 20 additional days of management leave be provided for this extension. That's one item. The next item is a flexible schedule that allows the executive director to reduce their commute time and work remotely. The flexible schedule will consist of 2 days a week in physically present in the FORA office and the remaining to work from a remote location. And the third term was a reimbursement of Medicare Part B premiums until June 30th, 2021. Those were the three requests that Mr. Hulamar made to us.
Thank you. Councilmember Morton.
So for clarification for the public and for the record, if I may verify this with either council, negotiator, or Mr. Hulamar, the request is that Mr. Hulamar is anticipating retiring effective September 1st of 2019, but for some agreement.
My original letter to the board of 9 weeks or 10 weeks ago suggested prior to September 1st.
Okay. And so the request is then being for some additional terms or compensation for Mr. Hulamar to continue as the executive director from September 1st through December 31st, 2019. And those terms being the terms that you just expressed.
Correct.
Thank you. And I know we belabored this in closed session, but I don't think it's clear for the record, and that's why I'm asking these questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Any board members want to start in on the discussion? Shall we open it to the public? No? All right. It seems like the board's a little fatigued at this moment. We'll let the public weigh in on this. Is there any member of the public who wishes to comment on what has been proposed? Okay, seeing none, I'll bring it back to the board for discussion. So I think Mr. Oglesby had a...
No, I don't. Well, no, I'm not going to make the motion. I support it, but I want to put something on the record first for clarification. Just like, and I appreciate Board Director Norton doing the same thing. But I think the record should reflect of all of the retirements that has taken place or perceived to take place within the next 30 days. I think 30 days is a good window. The retirements and people that have left. The attorney mentioned the name, but the public doesn't associate those names with anything. But when you say the assistant or the deputy executive director, you say the attorney, you say whatever Norris's roles were. I think we need to delineate clearly the amount of institutional knowledge that is left in the record. And so I think she made a good point. But hearing what he said, we all know who those people are. But for the public, they don't know what those responsibilities meant to us, and the job still needs to be done on the way out. So those are my comments.
Any other board members wishing to? Yes, board member Garfield.
It's sort of unprecedented. We've never closed down this institution before, and so at one point I actually called up Chair Parker and said, what happens if we're done with everything before June 30th? I mean, the timelines are uncertain. And so I don't think that'll happen. I think there will be still things undone. But, you know, if things can fall together in an optimistic scenario, but we don't know. We don't know what needs to be done and what is going to be out of our control to get done. So in times of uncertainty, for any organization, stability is very important. And we are subject to a great deal of change from departures of key individuals, as well as a number of different transition points in terms of offloading not offloading perhaps sounds like dumping, but the transfer of responsibilities of things like transportation to TAMC. So all of these issues will add more uncertainty and more complications. So I think when it's within our control to keep things stable, I'm in favor of doing that. And I think that's exactly why we had developed a retention and severance plan, so that we could be more orderly about retaining employees when it was possible to do so, with the acknowledgement that stability is really crucial. The plans for retention and severance did not involve the executive director. That was for all other employees. This is our opportunity to look at that issue for the executive director. And I'm in favor of the most stability we can possibly offer to the organization, to our partners where we're transitioning things from FORA to other institutions, to be able to give them as much institutional knowledge as possible. So to the extent that we can continue to keep Executive Director Hulamard engaged in this process, I'm in favor of doing so.
Any other board members wishing to weigh in? Director Phillips?
Well, I think all the people who know the most about this organization could help lead us as we wind down. It's Mr. Hulamard, and so I strongly support keeping him on as long as we can until we wind down. Do we need a motion? Yeah.
All right. Director Barron and then Director Carbone, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I would simply say to Director Garfield's and Director Phillips' comments, instability is coming. You know, Mr. Hulamard has indicated that he's only going to stay possibly 4 or 5 more months rather than 1 or 2 more months, and I think that date is coming. The changeover date is coming this year, and given that this organization may shut down in June of next year, possibly, it simply seems to me that the best time to address that instability is sooner rather than later. So we should, you know, this is an issue that's come up. I think the board should deal with the issue in the course of the next 6 weeks rather than simply postponing the issue for 6 weeks plus 3 months down the road. And that is what I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Carbone?
Yes, I somewhat agree with Mr. Barron, but I believe that I'm in favor of keeping Mr. Hulamard on and accepting his 3 months and his leadership and future training, getting someone set up in succession planning for the time, preparing them through the end of the FORA until through the end of FORA. So I think, to me, I'd like to make a motion the motion would be to approve his contract through December 30th, I think, 2019.
Under the terms stated by Dr. Ochoa.
I thought.
So there's a motion. Is there a second?
Clarifying question, I guess,
Yes.
Chair. Thank you. I thought I thought the attorney had a better understanding of what the negotiations between our subcommittee was, and maybe he can better articulate what the agreement between our subcommittee was.
I'm happy to help. I think the agreement, the terms of the agreement have been stated by Dr. Ochoa, correct? And what is the lack of clarity there? I mean, that we have 3 essential terms that Michael has requested, and that will be voted upon. I think there is also a there are certain directives that the that the board wants to discuss with Michael and give Michael for the time that he will be remaining. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, through the chair, I would just, maybe I should just did better by saying I think we empowered the subcommittee, and I would ask Dr. Chua if he would to move the motion with his understanding, and I would second it because I think he has a good understanding of what the full board or would like to do.
So, through the chair, if you'd like, I will retract my motion and let Dr. Ochoa give him the chance to give it a whirl.
The motion would be to reiterate the three conditions that Mr. Hulamard requested for an extension of his contract to December 27, 2019, which include 20 additional days of management leave, a flexible work schedule, and that would allow him to be physically present 2 days a week in the FORA office and work the remaining from a remote location, and reimbursement of Medicare Part B premium until June 30th, 2021. Those were the terms that he requested.
And that will be amendments to his existing contract.
Correct.
Right.
If it's been properly moved, then I second.
All right, there's a motion and a second. Further discussion? Yes, Ms. Garfield.
I'm not sure how logistically to do this, whether it's just a commentary, but terms of deliverables and actionable items will be addressed in the upcoming, like next month, contract performance agreement, just on the record so people know that it's not just open-ended, but this is the what's going to get done by when is an upcoming discussion.
Contract performance evaluation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Director Morton.
So I have a question and then a comment. So the representation is that these terms will have no impact on the CalPERS obligation that this organization will have with regard to Mr. Hulamard's position.
That is what has been represented, is what I think all the board members understand, as well as myself.
So this will be written to ensure that to be the case.
Yes.
Is that your responsibility? You're saying yes.
I think, sure. Yeah.
I want it to happen. I don't know who else to ask. I'm
Sure.
sorry, I didn't mean to. Okay. All right. So then I do have a comment if we're to that point. Okay. So to Director Barron's comment that we are in transition. We all know we're in transition. That this organization, all staff, will be exiting by June 30th, 2020. And what we're looking at here is a transition, whether it happens 6 months before that or 4 months before, or 10 months, excuse me. And I do think my concern, and I've addressed this, is that right now we have staff, when I look around this room and I look at the staff that we do have, that ensuring that someone that can be prepped to move up to the helm to get us over the last 10 months is critical to this organization. And I want to be sure that we are moving forward with that. I think it's advantageous for that person to be selected sooner, that you're more apt to have somebody that's eligible, capable, trainable, that may stay for 10 months as opposed to 6 months. So the transition, the chaos is going to happen if it is going to happen. I am not of the opinion that it will. I think the people sitting at these tables here are extraordinarily capable, extraordinarily knowledgeable about the issues as directors and what we need to accomplish and do. We've been through the transition discussion ad nauseum for 3 years, if not 4 years. And I look at the people in this room and how many times I have relied on the individuals in this room that are FORA staff and/or consultants now also, that have given me incredible information and I think can do the job. And this is not in a personal affront, but I do recognize Mr. Hulamard is stating that it's his interest to retire at the end of August, sometime before September 1. And I respect that and value him and his personal decisions. So I will not be supporting the motion.
Thank you. Any other comments? I think we did open it up to the public, but the public didn't know much then, so you know more now. So I thought if any member of the public did have any comments or questions on what the board is discussing, I'll give you another chance. Okay, I'll bring it back to this board. We do have a motion and a second. I guess the only comment I would make is I tend to agree that we need to be focusing on the leadership that will be needed after the end of December, all the way through to June of 2020, if not longer. So but I think the thing that's the most uncomfortable for me about what's being proposed is it's like an enhanced retirement plan. And as public officials, we have retirement plans that are administered by the state, and I think those are adequate. So I'm not comfortable in enhancing what I think is already a good retirement package. So if there are no other comments, I'm prepared to call for the vote. I believe we could, yes, and Director Oglesby
I'll
has...
be fairly quick, and I agree with the chair about enhancing someone's retirement. I don't look at it like that. I look at it as this is a benefit for the community. So I don't want to catch the executive director off guard with this, but I want to know, can he recite for the record the numbers of employees that are left and their positions, so the public can have an understanding of what we're dealing with as a board.
Director Oglesby, thank you for the request. We have 6 principal employees that have made significant adjustments in the last several months. The first would be Helen Rodriguez, who still remains with us for 10 hours a week and helps us to supervise all of our ongoing controller activities. But we'll also be overseeing the audit, which will be just in the next couple of months. The second is Jonathan Brinkman, who's taken a position with the Local Area Formation Commission, happens to be here today, might comment on the transition item from a different post today. We lost to Cuyo, Yoneda Lopez to Monterey Salinas Transit. She is now their marketing manager. She was an assistant in our planning and construction department. Robert Norris, who was our principal planner, has retired and gets on a plane to go to Mexico tomorrow. He handled veterans activities, prevailing wage, and pretty much all of our human resources. We lost Steve Ensley to retirement as well. He has moved on to do other consulting items. He handled a lot of our finance background stuff. He was a former finance director, former city manager in Delray Oaks, a very solid manager. And so that's been the folks that have taken off during the course of the last several months. And in addition to that, our wonderful colleagues in the city of Seaside stole our transition plan coordinator, prevailing wage coordinator, and risk manager, Sherry Damon.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from board members? All right. There's been a request that we take this vote as a roll call vote, so I turn it over to the clerk.
Thank you. Director Oglesby?
Yes.
Director Parker?
No.
Director Phillips?
Yes.
Director Berkeley? Director Hoffa?
Yes.
Director Wizard?
Yes.
Director Gunter? Director Barron?
No.
Director Gagliotti,
Yes.
Director Morton, Director Carbone, it's okay. Director Carbone
Yes.
and Director Garfield.
Yes.
8-4.
Thank you. All right, so we will move now to business item 8C, building removal financing update.
Yes, Chair, we have been working on this building removal for several months now at the board's direction. We undertook an effort that was solicited by several members of the administrative committee and several members of the public working on the issues in Marina, Seaside, and the county that still are here with respect to building removal, the blighted view that many people have of the former Fort Ord. Josh Metz is going to give a quick building removal update. It will take him just a few minutes to bring you up to date.
Hello, nice to be here, and I have just taken on this project, which was more than deftly handled by my colleague Jonathan Brinkman before, so I'm coming up to speed on a complex issue, so bear with me. But I can show you that there's a process that's been underway for some time, since October of last year, when the board directed staff to investigate the feasibility of bonding, both financial and legal, and that came directly from a request from the Seaside City Manager to look at ways that the blight could be removed as a parting gift from FORA. So following a RFP and consultant selection process, we were able to bring on board NHA Advisors, which is based in San Rafael, and the principal, Mark Northcross, has been actively engaged with the administrative committee and our communities to develop some detailed analysis, which is shown in your packet. And in spring 2019, the first step, phase 1, confirmed the financing legality, and phase 2 determined that financial feasibility. And so those items are included in the report that's in the packet. The next steps in front of us include receiving a final recommendation from the admin committee, which possibly could be here in August. There is some tight time frames to move this forward, given the FORA transition, and even with the SB 189 potentially advancing, my understanding is that all bonding capacity from FORA would end June 30th, 2020, even if there is an extension of a shell or a reduced board. So that would have to be done before then. Fall 2019, the board here would review the recommendation from the admin committee and take action, begin the bond issuance process before the, that should be fall 2019 right there. The bond issuance process would begin this fall, and then funding building removal activities as soon as the winter quarter. So this is not a great slide for viewing, but it is included as in your packet. I believe it's page 36. It's Appendix B, and it really shows 4 different scenarios that NHA Advisors has developed, which look at FORA transition or closing down by 2020 without bond issuance, closing down with bond issuance in 2020, or also closing down in 2022 without bond issuance, and closing down in 22 with bond issuance. And the basic outcome is that the bond issuing would provide funds to direct towards building removal at various levels, which each of the jurisdictions are kind of summarized. The implications to the dollars generated from that bond issuance are summarized in this table. So this is an ongoing topic of discussion. In fact, up until today, there are versions of the scenario that are being kind of tweaked with. I know that the NHA advisors work closely with county staff, Melanie Beretti, and folks from the county auditor's office getting into detail on some of the assumptions. This is a model, so it is really dependent on the assumptions included in the model. And I can say, just from my participation at the admin committee meetings, I've been very impressed with Mark Northcross from NHA Advisors. I mean, the guy knows his stuff. He is very steeped in the material and is able to answer most questions posed by the committee. And so that's the status of things, and I would turn it back to Michael or stand here to try to answer your questions.
Yes, I would just add, Chair, that I think the Administrative Committee feels very strongly that they are making a great deal of headway in this regard. They've looked at a number of things. Some of them sort of leak into policy questions. When you look at some of these charts and graphs, you look at the fact that a major revenue might be coming from the county, but the county might not have as much building removal as others, so that's an issue that has to be addressed at some point. And there are other questions that have sort of crept into the discussion, but this board's incentive for moving ahead with this was to get rid of buildings. There has been some concern that when these dollars become available, instead of as we had it in the past, that FORA monies only went to above ground removals, that they be made flexible, that can be used both above ground and below ground. They think there's some benefits for doing that. We just ran into some issues about below ground concrete on one of our projects. So there's a couple of issues where it's important for us to build flexibility into this, but the Administrative Committee thinks we'll have a much more detailed and more specific recommendation for the board to absorb in August, but we wanted you to know that we are making great progress.
All right, thank you. Any questions from board members? Director Garfield.
Thank you, Chair. Is this something, all of these scenarios are with 5 remaining land use jurisdictions. Is it possible, say, if Delray Oaks decided they didn't want to participate, that this bonding could go forward with only 4?
That's a great question.
Is there an answer?
The bonding is built upon the FORA board's authority to use its revenue to bond against.
But there are mentions in here of the way that the risk calculation and therefore the premium that you need to give on the interest rate is calculated by characteristics of the underlying jurisdictions.
So whenever you take out an underlying jurisdiction, you limit the ability to bond. So the impact would be you would lose revenue that would be available for building removal.
So it'd have to be recalculated, but it's not like this is a package deal where it's all for one and one for all. There are scenarios that are for less than 5. Could be. Thank you. That's all that's just a question about that. Thanks.
Any other board member questions? Yes, Director Morton.
So I know this is still working its way through the admin committee. Is the authority for this, for bonding under the revenue bond law of 1941, is that the authority for this? And I pulled that from the government code that created us.
Well, the revenue...
And somebody can... I mean, if that's a legal question that needs to be looked at. My next question is that we're only bonding that portion of the property tax that's collected that would go to FORA if FORA was in existence, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And the total property tax, going to Josh directed us to page 36. When we're obligating to generate the bonds someplace between 25 and 31 million, that we're anticipating payments of about $2 million. And down at the bottom of that page, it says that the additional available share of the taxes would be $2.4 4 million in 2021 that would still come to FORA. Am I reading that correctly?
Yes,
And then in 2022, it would be 2.9 million.
yes.
Okay. So those that would be the revenue that this organization post-20, if it's extended 2021 and 2022, would rely on for its existence to spend as the budgets get created.
I don't know that that's the only revenue. There are other revenues, but yes.
CFD, I get that, but I'm trying to make sure. So the question that I have, if we're trying to maximize, my understanding is, let me start with question one. My understanding is that 25 to 31 million will not remove the totality of the blight within all of the jurisdictions on the former Fort Ord. Is that correct? The cost exceeds that.
Yes.
Okay. So the next question is, why would we not use more of this projected tax revenue, obligate the tax revenue at a higher level to generate a higher bond yield to take down more blight?
That's one of the scenarios we've asked Mark Northcross to look at. It is possible to put more resources that way, but of course, you have to recognize when doing a bond issuance, they only allow you to use very conservative, so it's not like you can take 90% of your revenues, because they'll assume that it won't be 90% that you'll get. They like to use a lower loan-to-value, or the equivalent of a loan-to-value ratio. Okay.
Yeah, so I understand that, but I'm looking for where is that number. So Mark, I forgot his last name. Northcross is looking at that scenario to determine if we would have enough, basically, retention of tax as security to make sure we can service the bonds, but get more than 25 to 31 million in a bond yield.
Currently, he's been suggesting that current market conditions, if we were to move this week, we could probably be closer to 36 million. But I think we need him to look at all of the scenarios, and when that comes to the board to decide, remember we still have certain resource implications for LAFCO's concern about risk post the current FORA, whether there's an extension past 2020 or not, and whatever the board is that sustains past 2020 to 2022, what their risk or exposure is. So there's a couple of risk matters as well. So there's only a certain amount of dollars, and I think what Mark was trying to address was that question that we had posed about LAFCO's question about risk.
And so what I'm trying to find there is where's the cap? Is because you need to retain some of your earnings excess. You need to have excess tax increment for debt service, for the fluctuation in debt service, and basically have money in the bank, plus what would we have to operate in 2021, 2022 is versus maximizing your yield to take down the blight. So additional scenarios will be run for us.
Right. We're anticipating doing this under Mark's rules, as you probably read, and we'll make sure to make a record of this and pass this along to Mark. Make sure that question gets discussed by the administrative committee.
And just there is a table 6, page 33 in the report that shows the bonding capacity by scenario. So there's a more hopeful scenario and a more conservative scenario that they looked at, where Michael arrived at that $36 million number. So those are the conditions that they looked at, and there's some detailed description of that in the text preceding the table.
And then the other questions I have, they don't need to be answered, but they're focused that I would like to have when this is addressed, is to ensure that the bond issuance is for the intended purpose of blight removal. What are the documents that would be required for that? And then how is it, there's a proposal in here about the allocation of these funds among the different jurisdictions for their blight responsibilities. And my question is, what would be the basis for that allocation? This is a report, it's not somebody's recommendation. but also, once we do agree that before the bond goes to issuance, what document would be necessary to ensure that that allocation moves forward, that the next board doesn't alter it or modify it or change it? What's the document?
Well, the uses of the funds will be according to the determination made by this board. That board won't be in existence when it comes, just like we're restricted now with our Mellow Roots program. But Mark's Roots bond issuance would be limited to those uses. So
we would specify in the bond documents the specific allocation and the footprint within which, for example, if Marina was getting 10% of the bond issuance money, is that money would be utilized within the footprint of Marina city limits on the former corridor. And that would be part of your bond issuance by a map or something being attached.
I'm not as current on this particular issue as Jonathan Brinkman is. Maybe he could help us.
Okay. I didn't need answers to all of this, but I am looking for this clarification as this matter comes forward.
Okay, member of the public, Jonathan Brinkman, AFCO Senior Analyst. So I think the intention here is that there will be an agreement amongst the jurisdictions about how the use of this funding would be done, and that will be needed prior to issuance of the bond. So it does require quite a bit of attorneys looking at documents, being sure this is how we want to use the funds and this is where we want to use the funds, and that will take time, of course, to put together and bring back to the board.
Great, thank you. Any other questions by board members? All right, any other members of the public with comments or questions on this item?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
just to clarify, we're not experts on this either, but we did work with City Salinas on their bond issuance for Measure X funds, and one of the things that we learned in that process was that because you don't necessarily know where your bond proceeds are going to come out when you make the issuance, they might be higher or lower. You can have a list that's longer than what you're actually going to, you can have a longer list of eligible projects for your bond funding because it may be that your costs are lower than you thought or whatever, and so you kind of want to err on the side of having a slightly longer list of eligible projects for it. Makes it a little bit easier to make your decision as to what's going to be on your list.
Thank you. Any other comments by board members? I guess I would just say, it sounds like there are things to be worked out and maybe negotiations between jurisdictions. From the county's perspective, I want to make sure that there's a benefit to the county, and I don't understand how maybe if there's more money that might be sort of the county's share than the county has in projects and buildings to remove, what's the mechanism? I want to make sure this gets used for blight removal, and I mean there's a broader community benefit, but I think some of these details really are still to be worked out, and I know there are discussions about other things that the money might get used for the county, and I definitely want to see some of those things done, but I think this bond issuance for blight removal needs to stay focused on blight removal. We know there's not enough money, even if we go to the maximum, there's not enough money in the bond issuance to complete all of the building removal, so I think we just need to make sure that we're staying focused on that and making sure we've got the documents that clarify how we're going to proceed.
Madam
Yes.
Chair,
Yes,
just as
Director
a point of
Hoffa.
order, I just want to note, I think we're down to 8 members. I'm going to have to leave at 5, so just wanted to make note of that.
Thank you. Yes, and I know someone else needs to leave close to 5 as well. So, good. We will move then to, if there are no further comments or questions on the building removal, we'll move to the transition plan implementing agreements.
Yes, Chair, all the members of the Administrative Committee and others have been working with our colleagues at RGS, and Kendall Flint has a presentation she'll provide that similar to one that she provided to the Administrative Committee. All of the members of the board should have had available to them a draft of one version of the implementing agreement, which we kind of call the global or the universal, the one that's going to be used the most in terms of organization. And so Kendall's put together an extraordinary PowerPoint presentation that kind of gives you headlines of all of the sections with right on the board how each section fits.
Thank you. Just a heads up on that this agreement is in fact in process, and largely because it ties back to the legislation which is currently working its way through Sacramento. So I'm sure if you look at the document, you'll notice there's several things in there that show a 2020 and a 2022 end, and that is intentional. Just a reminder, you are here. We're in July, so we have basically got to the point where we have draft structure of the implementing agreement that we've been working very closely with the admin committee as well as with member agencies and many of the ex officios to make sure that it has the comments in. One of the purposes of today's conversation is really to give you an opportunity to ask any questions that you might have, and then also knowing that at some point, shockingly, there will be comments from your attorneys, and we look forward to that as well. Just as a reminder, basically what our job here is to basically memorialize which functions are going to transition from FORA to other agencies and or the successor agency. And again, we've got two paths that are going at the same time. One imagines a 2020 end of FORA, and the other looks at a 2022 end of FORA. It will be one or the other, and our anticipation is we will have an answer to that likely in August of this year. And at that point, we will update our documents to reflect Sacramento's wisdom, so to speak. We know with the initial implementing agreements that these are going to be between the 5 agencies that have property, and that would basically be Delray Oaks, Marina, the City of Monterey, Seaside, and Monterey County. So currently right now there are 20 sections in the implementing agreements. I'm not going to go through them line by line, but I want to give you the headline on what these look like. So the first section is basically recitals, and it's the boring legalese that basically establishes the organization, the jurisdictions, FORA. These are things you've likely seen before. And again, just pointing out that little highlighted bit at the bottom, this will reflect the adoption date for Monning's bill, when and if that is signed into legislation. If it is not, then that section would be removed. When you look at the Section 2, governance, this is now reflecting what is most current in the legislation, which basically looks at a 5-member board made up of county, the City of Delray Oaks, Marina, Seaside, and Monterey. And then per the assembly version, there are 3 ex officio members that would be on that board, one from Marina Coast Water District, one from United States Army, and one from Cal State UMB. Section 3 relates to water allocations. Now, as a reminder, FORA will not actually be a part of that agreement. That will be between the individual jurisdictions as well as some of the ex officios and Marina Coast Water District. What this really says, it basically memorializes that everyone understands, and I think we've talked about this before in admin and here, that water will move to MCWD moving forward in terms of the management of that. Their current agreements, which are working through the jurisdictions, memorialize the allocations that were established through the initial FORA agreement, so those have been maintained. And in speaking with them, they're very close to being able to present those to each of your agencies. So I'm sure you've all had some chats with them at this point, and that is moving forward. The second, Section 4 in general, this goes to capital improvements for local roads. We talked about this in May, and we've also talked about this with the admin committee. And basically this section relates back to the local roads projects that are currently in the CIP for FORA, but would be transferred to the local jurisdictions. Now, I want to be very clear about this. These are not obligated projects to build. These are projects that, should development happen in your community, that you would then take these projects on if they become necessary of mitigation measures later. The admin committee felt very strongly that they wanted to see the individual roads listed so that they knew who went with what, and that's why they've been included in there. But again, these only become implemented if in fact there's development that happens down the road that requires them. Now, the Section 5 relates to the regional road projects. And again, we talked about this in May. We've also talked about this with admin, and our folks have met extensively with the TAMC staff and actually thanked them for some of their input on the document. And what this really says is that at the point that FORA as an entity no longer exists, whether that's 2020 or 2022, that TAMC would take over as the agency that would deal with regional projects. They've actually already constructed a model that looks at how they would collect those fees, with FORA being, I believe, FORA Zone 5. And the question is really when that would take place. That's another thing that would be part of this implementing process. Again, it can happen sooner. It does not have to wait till the close of 2022 if that went forward, but that would be at the board's discretion and direction at a later date. Section 6, this is the exciting one. This is the Habitat Conservation Plan. Now, our implementing agreements are not structured to take this particular item on, and we've had numerous discussions about this with all the member agencies. I'm reiterating again, the way that the transition plan works as well as the legislation, member agencies of 13 of them, as well as some of the landholders with the various other agencies, would need to form either a joint powers authority or a cooperative agreement of some type in order to move forward with the idea of collectively processing those permits for the HCP. If individual agencies decide that they do not want to do that, or for whatever reason it does not come together, then the default would be the habitat management plan, which would then become the responsibility of each agency. And I think one thing that we've heard, at least on the RGS side, numerous times, is there's a concern that with these implementing agreements, people want to make sure that they're not signing something that obligates them to a financial obligation within the HCP, HMP. It does not. It basically says that that other agreement will be a standalone on another spot, but you need to be aware that these things will not be funded by FORA specifically. They would be funded through those agencies that are landholders within that particular area. And it also talks again about date, things like that. The only other thing that is a little different here, the 21 million that was cited at this time is actually closer to 17, 18 at this point. So we are looking at what that whole funding capability might be, and again, that'll be based on what comes out of the individual jurisdictions' agreements. When we look at ordinance, this is actually one of the easier ones, which is ironic since it's about things that blow up. No one seems to have a problem with either Seaside and or if it becomes Monterey, but we do believe it will be the city of Seaside. This is taking on the ESCA. Seaside is in the process of putting together a plan that would be submitted to Army. Speaking with Colonel Ford, the Army will have probably 2 or 3 months of turnaround time with Department of Toxic Substances and Fish and what all the other folks they have to do to approve that. But both Army and the city have also been working with FORA staff, and we're working on transitioning staff to Seaside if that is the way it works out. So this is one of those areas where you might see the transition of staff or the role of ESCA leaving FORA prior to 2020 or probably in the first or second quarter of next year. This is, again, another one of those things that does not have to wait. It can be shifted over provided the Army signs off on it and all the parties are in agreement. Your ordinance ESCA implementing agreements will actually be coming back to the board in August. I'll talk about that again in a minute, but again, they're very straightforward. They're very much based on the same type of things that you've already seen previously. There are 3 sections here that deal with records retention, land transfer reporting requirements, and of course, dissolution of the authority. And Melanie, God bless her heart, at the county, she's been great helping me out with some of these sections because most of them do in fact go to the county. Some of this is required by the current legislation, and some of it is just a function of the way that it would most likely be most efficient. So records retention, records management, that's everything from personnel files to the website maintenance, would go to the county. The county would take over as the identified Economic Development Corporation successor, as well as the local reuse authority. And these are relatively minor in the big picture of things. I think we talked a little bit earlier. There are some processes and projects that still, pieces of land that still have to transfer over. And in the course of doing that, there's a reporting requirement for economic development that still has to be met, and it has to be met by a single agency, much like the ESCA. So the idea here is that the county would be most likely taking that on, and that's how it's written at this point. And what that would mean is, let's say hypothetically that Marina or Seaside had a piece of property, they would file their report, they'd file it with the county, and then the county would file on behalf of those agencies back to Army's Economic Development Corp. And then finally, dissolution of the authority. This is another one that pretty straightforward, but the way the legislation is written and the way your transition plan is written, whenever all is said and done, whether it's 2020 or 2022, there will be funds in a bank account somewhere. Hopefully it's not in the Bahamas or someplace that you can't get to it, but the idea is the board will have to come to a decision about how to allocate that money. Is it going to go to HCP? Are you going to allocate it, on a pro rata basis to each of the jurisdictions? How are you going to work that out? That's probably the next really fun discussion that you will have. There are 10 other sections in the agreements, and these are all based on the previous agreements that you have signed over the years. There's nothing really new in there, but just want to let you know that these are all the things that talk about disputes, severability, negotiations, mediation, whatnot, the definition of the word day, things like that. So those are basically the sections as we move forward. Again, once the legislation is completed, coupled with any feedback we get from you or your attorneys, then we'll come up with a revised version that would likely come back before the board September to have some action taken on it. Marina Coast Water, of course, is moving forward at this point with their agreements. Again, we anticipate that those will be coming before all of your councils where they are relevant within the next several weeks to begin the pipeline. And then, of course, the ESCA agreements, which will also include the Veteran Cemetery, MPC, and UC Santa Cruz. Those will be available next month. And then this is just a quick glance again about where we sort of are. We're kind of winding down on the implementing agreements at this point. So we've basically completed the first, as much as we can at this point with the implementing agreements. MCWD, we've been working with them obviously, and they're moving forward with theirs. We're looking at the ESCA that will happen in August with some hopeful resolution in September, and then we'll be looking at a timeline with Army about how we transfer that staff over to that agency should it be Seaside. The EDC successor and the local reuse authority successor are also addressed in these agreements. And then, of course, we just want to remind everybody again and again and again, the HCP, JPA, or cooperative, whatever that might be, you do need to figure that out and how you're going to move forward with that. And that, of course, includes a wider group. It's 13 altogether that would be signatories on that should you move forward. The local roads have been addressed in the implementing agreements, and I apologize for the FORA staffing plan, but my colleagues at RGS have been working really closely with Mr. Hulamard and staff here, working on the transition of how staff moves from where they are now to their next happy homes like Jonathan and others that have done that. But the idea here is, as you've discussed today, we're moving in a direction that means there'll be less people that will be required in order to complete the business of FORA moving forward. So with that, there's the only things that are left on the FORA side, and we've got a couple of agreements, one being the final LAFCO liability and risk agreement between FORA and LAFCO, which has been ongoing, and then of course the management and completion of your CIP projects, which are the South Boundary Road project and General Gym completion. The only remaining items for us, there are about 15 or 16 smaller agreements out there. Some of these have actually already terminated, but we're reviewing them. And these are oftentimes agreements that have a fiscal impact, whether it was a loan or a land use share or something like that. So we've got about 15 more to go, and we will be finished with those in the next couple of weeks. So when we come back in August, those should be done as well. In some cases, there will be new agreements required to reaffirm those relationships or how they might work. And in other cases, those agreements will no longer be enforced because they will have either been invalidated by date, time, or they will have already been fulfilled. So we are jamming right to the end of our little finish line, and again, that puts us still on track for final agreements coming back to the board in the fall with final board approvals possibly in the winter, and again on June 20th of 2020 or June 20th of 2022, which we'll know better, I guess, August, September. One of those two things will happen, where there'll be a successor board moving forward, or FORA will sunset. So that really concludes my presentation, but I'm available obviously to answer any questions you might have or address any concerns that I can at this time.
Thank you. Board members with questions? Yes, Director Morton. Actually, could I ask a quick question first? Sure. I know that the attorneys haven't been part of this, and I see how much Monterey County is going to be responsible for. When do the attorneys get to take a look at this?
I would strongly urge you to have the attorneys take a look at it now, just to give them a preview so they can see anything that's going to jump out at them, because the things that are going to change from our perspective are things that will be from the legislation. But just as a caveat, if the legislation doesn't pass, I mean, I think it will, but if it does not pass, then these agreements are pretty close to done, because they are. So I would have them have a cursory look at it, but I wouldn't invest. It's not the final. I would tell them that it's a preview version we would expect that, again, as soon as that legislation is confirmed, we would immediately get those out. I know that Melanie, for the county as an example, has been working with county council, and they have had some looks at these as well as some of the other folks. So,
Thank you. Director Morton?
Yes, so I have a question, several questions, but I don't know, are your pages numbered? I'm looking at, if you find section 2, governance, the paragraph above that is item K, sale or lease proceeds. And it says this means consideration received by the jurisdiction or FORA for purposes of section 4D and 4E when leasing property. So it looks like it's controlling our land sale revenues. But I can't find section 4D or 4E to what you're referencing.
I know exactly what you're talking about, and that was that's one of our whoops. Thank you for pointing that out. I will make that change because FORA no longer has the ability to control that when FORA is no longer there.
Okay, so that would be omit.
Yes.
Okay, well, that makes me happier. Then the other question that I had, you talked about the Habitat Conservation Plan as being in here, and you said that FORA is no longer going to fund that when FORA sunsets, whichever year that is. But you also made this statement, Kendall. You said funding by landholders. And currently how we fund that is by development. And the FORA model has always been you only fund when you collect the revenues. So what I am looking for the city of Marina is that we obviously want our habitat conservation plan and any other obligation, if you want to call them obligations, as you said with the roads, are funded by the development. And so when you made that comment that it's funded by landholders, no, it's funded by development. So I'm just concerned, and you also have referenced in there 21 million by June 30th, 2020. I think in the most recent forecast at our finance committee, it was 17.6 million by that year.
Yeah, I think I mentioned that, and I apologize.
But
I mentioned that we know that that's lower, but I want to address about the local jurisdiction because it does, and I'll put in some alternate language on that. But here's the thing. Most jurisdictions would do that through developer impact fees. That's absolutely true. However, a jurisdiction absolutely could decide to do something using general fund or using other fees or applying for grant fees. There are a variety of ways they can do it. I think the intent of the language was that the jurisdiction is responsible for however it would be funded. And as an example, should the jurisdiction, depending on how the FORA board moves forward, there may be additional funds from that 17 million. There may be additional funds from future CFD revenues. There may be other funding sources that, much like transportation dollars, we're looking at those as different pots of money. So I'll clarify that if that works for you. That basis it would be such as developer impact fees, grants, or future revenues from the trust, that sort of thing.
So what I'm just trying to make sure is the model that we've used here at FORA, you collect the revenues, then you incur the cost, is still the model that each jurisdiction is required to follow, that we're not required to go into our general fund, except by election, should we want to.
Right.
So the other thing that I had was that you have in here what's going to happen, the disbursement of funds. I think it might have been paragraph 10 upon the dissolution. And what I did note in Senator Moning's legislation is in conflict with that. What Senator Moning's legislation is excess CFD is going to go to the county. Upon dissolution of the authority, all remaining CFD revenues transferred to the county of Monterey. It gives the county of Monterey at line 1 on page 26 of the bill, the Board of Supervisors has the sole discretion to decide how those funds are going to be allocated, which is one of the reasons the City of Marina objects to this, because the Board of Supervisors are not elected by my constituents.
Right.
So that's a real difficulty for us, that all of us are deferring to 5 Board of Supervisors that don't answer to our jurisdictions. But it's in conflict, so which is going to control? The legislation?
It'll be the legislation.
Versus the contract.
It'll be the legislation, but I also want to point out one other thing, and I mentioned it briefly before. It is our recommendation, and we hope that you will move forward that the idea is that any CFD funds that have not been spent, whatever's in the bank, that's what that refers to, right? But if as a board, whether it's this year or it's the successor board, if you as a board allocate those funds out prior to whatever that sunset date is, then there are no remaining funds that go to the county. So I would highly encourage this board to consider agendizing at some point, once you know what the legislation is going to be, that discussion, which I anticipate will be very spirited, about how you want to allocate all that out. Because if you leave it, you're absolutely correct. You are taking away your ability to influence that decision to spend.
Yes, that's my concern. So I just wanted to point that out in your presentation, is that may be moved if the legislation passes. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Director Cagliotti.
Yeah, I just had one. I just wanted to clarify. I mean, I was bringing it up, but in section 4, the capital improvements, the local roads. This is the delta that's not funded, specifically with regard to South Boundary and Delray Oaks, right?
Right.
It would be anything over what's not already funded.
Right. So you have two projects that are already funded now. Those are over here.
Right.
So these are other projects that have not been funded as of this time.
Okay.
And have not been required. Let me make sure. Also are not required as a mitigation at this time.
Right. That was okay. That was.
So there's no. Yeah, you are not burdened with that until or if development happens that triggers that as a mitigation.
Yeah, the burden part wasn't the part it was more just getting the road in and having that funded. That was the part that was. Thank you very much. Oh, and also Chair, if I would, to kind of address that, I mean, when I read that, my understanding of that language is that the mitigation is the responsibility of the jurisdiction, like the habitat conservation, and then the jurisdiction has to figure out how that gets paid for. That's my understanding of habitat conservation plan.
We're not sure.
No. Any other board members with questions? Any member of the public wanting to comment?
Oh, I had other questions. I'm sorry, as a director, are we asking questions on the staff report also, or just on this transition?
It's the whole item.
Okay.
So let's
Well,
let the public and then we'll come back. Yeah. Great, thanks.
Hi, Tom Mancini. I am the FORA representative to the Veterans Cemetery Advisory Committee. By the way, that committee was established by the county in 2005 by the supervisors. I was asked at yesterday's committee meeting if there were any issues I saw on today's agenda, and I said, no, I didn't see any. I didn't see any. However, Mr. Sid Williams, who was the vice chair of the Veterans Cemetery Advisory Committee, he's also a member of the Veterans Issue Advisory Committee here on pages 18 and 19. And I said, what's the problem? He said, well, it appears in his opinion that there is nothing mentioned in the implementation of the transition plan that addresses veterans or the cemetery issue. The problem that we have here is phase 2 is underway. And if you look on page 18 and 19, you'll see that Mr. Robert Norris was the Forest Cemetery Administrator. Well, Mr. Norris is no longer here. So the question is, who is going to be the advocate, or what agency is going to be responsible to work with FORA and the state? Thank you. Missed that one.
I think that's in our, the one at the end where it's about the 15s to 19. I think your agreement is one of those. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other member of the public wishing to comment?
Chair Parker, members of the board, Jonathan Brinkman, LAFCO Senior Analyst. Just wanted to recognize that the microphone works just as well on this end, and just have 3 brief comments. And basically, the comments from LAFCO's perspective is the progression of the multi-agency transition implementing agreement looks like it's proceeding well, that there's collegial discussions, working discussions in the administrative committee. The sections do cover the forest CIP items and obligations, also the forest dissolution section. And a second point, just wanted to comment also, as LAFCO, we look forward to working with FORA closely on the liability agreement. So that's a concern of LAFCO, and we'll look forward to working staff level and attorney level for that. And then also just LAFCO's continued to be engaged on all these transition plan implementing agreements to ensure that orderly dissolution of FORA. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any other public comment on this item? All right, with that, we'll bring it back. And I know that Director Hoffa has to leave. Did you want to say anything before you pedal off into the sunset? Okay, thank you. So I think Director Morton, you had a couple more questions?
I did. I'm reviewing the staff report. I don't know who signed this. I'm sorry, I should. Michael signed it and Josh Metz. So in the statement under status update pending legislation, it has the comment that it states, let's see here, underlying land use jurisdictions to oversee property tax, CFD, other revenues, revision of the CFD boundaries, and includes a CEQA Act exemption. The revision of the CFD boundaries, I'm unable to find that in the proposed statute, and I'm asking where you gleaned that from. Where's Josh? Or Mr. Who am I? Do you know where you got that from? I can't find it.
I will check that. I think that may have been something that was in the first draft and then was deleted.
Okay.
And I think that may be the case. I'll double check that and get back to you.
Okay, so that was one question that I had.
I think that's making reference to the fact that the boundary gets amended as other CFDs or others get taken, and so there was some language in there. But that's probably not sufficiently clear.
But I can't find the language wherein a jurisdiction can make its own CFD and reduce the FORA boundaries, and that's where I'm trying to see that. This comment keeps being repeated, both at the session at the Assembly, or where you were on Thursday, whatever day it was.
Oh, no, I wasn't there.
Some committee. And it's
check.
in your staff report,
I will check.
too, so thank you. And that's the second question about that. Are we, as jurisdictions, able to create our own CFD and remove our property, take responsibility for what our obligations are under this transition implementing agreements, implementing plan agreements, which is part of the reason why I'm trying to understand this before I'm reading your agreements, Kendall, is I'm truly trying to understand what are our obligations and what are our rights and how we're going to make this work, and they intertwine. So that was a question for me. And then the statute also continues with the ability for post-2020, the amendment of the section allows for FORA to continue to levy taxes. And I'm going to find that code section for you. And how does that, it is at page 60 of our staff report, line 27, the board may in any year levy assessments, reassessments, or special taxes to finance these base-wide public facilities in accordance with list items. And that is the amended section, meaning that's in effect from July 1, 2020 through June 30th, 2022, which again is in conflict with these transition implementing plan agreements. And that's why I'm calling these out. I know nobody has an answer, but I'm trying to reconcile
Steve's recording them so we can...
I'm trying to reconcile
yeah.
what we're statutorily going to be required to do or have the authority to do versus what we're contractually obligating to do, and making sure I'm not counting what resources we have twice. So I point those out. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other board member comments? I did have a couple comments. When I started reading this draft, I can see why you started sort of saying, well, if this, then that, and having the different dates. But it seems to me that it's just mixing everything up. So the transition plan is for FORA sunsetting June 30th, 2020. That's what these implementing agreements are supposed to be about. If SB 189 passes, there's no, I don't think the county, I mean, I would feel very uncomfortable having the county sign on to something that is where conditions are going to be changing over the next 2 to 3 years, and it might not make sense at all. So I don't see why we're even putting 2022 in here, because I just don't get it. I don't see how anyone would sign on to this, and would we even need to? So then the other thing that is concerning to me is something that Director Morton asked a question about, was the county using its own resources to build, say, Eastside Parkway, which was in our on our list, and fund the county's share of the habitat plan, and we don't know what the plan is, and so, which is kind of, it gets to the urgency of being able to know what are the financial assumptions that we're talking about, whether we're talking about an HCP or an HMP. What are the financial assumptions and model for revenue and allocation of money? Sure. Because anyway, I just think that's it's a huge liability for the county between those two, tens of millions of dollars, and so I think it's part of the hazard of not having the attorneys involved as we go forward, because I think they probably would have caught that.
Well, I think it's in your best interest to of course share that at this time. I think there's a couple things. One, we had FORA staff and RGS staff met with EPS last week, and actually I met with them yesterday. They're looking at some models for what I think it's going to come back to the board again at another time, but they are looking at what those costs may be for implementation. The environmental document should be out within the next 30, 60 days, and during that comment period, everyone will have a greater opportunity to look and see what those costs might be. But I'm going to reiterate again, which I know I sound like a broken record, you must get together as jurisdictions and have the conversation about how that is going to look, whether it's a JPA or a cooperative, whatever you do, because if you don't come to some agreement on how you want that model to go, right, there's no way that you can construct a cost basis for that without the jurisdictions agreeing on what that cost should be based upon. So I would encourage you to have that conversation quickly, because it's coming down the pipe rather fast. And I think in all candor, you're not a group that moves really quickly. So you probably want to start talking about that now rather than waiting till later.
To that point, for 3 years, we talked about the obligations for roads, the cost of roads as of a date, maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I don't know for sure. But the water augmentation, the roads, the habitat conservation plan, 192.5 million or 194 million. And what on full build out, what our CFD at 24,000 per residential and whatever the ratio is for commercial, that we were only going to generate 127 million. We had a $67 million shortfall. That is the lens within which I, as representative for Marina, are reading your transition plan implementing agreement and trying to ensure that I am not obligating my city, when I vote here in the city of Marina, is that I only have the money that is development fees, or that I can collect from impact fees, or that I can collect under the FORA CFD to apply towards our responsibilities. And I know there's a delta of 67 million. And so I am asking these agreements to articulate very clearly in their language that not only is the city of Marina, but Delray Oaks, Monterey, Seaside, and the county are not obligated, but for what they generate from development to pay the impacts of development. And I don't see this yet. And that's why I'm pointing out these points and pointing out the conflict with statute. I appreciate all the efforts that your team have put in, but I also see these glaring problems that are going to either evolve into financial disaster for the jurisdictions and or litigation. So thank you for taking the points in recording however you're doing it.
Yes.
Great. Yeah, it has taken a lot of work and a lot of conversation to, to get us here, and there's still more to be done. Yeah. So, all right, are there any other board member comments or questions at this point? All right, thank you very much for being here and for bringing that to us. So it is now after 5 o'clock. We once again have our Special District Management Authority Board of Directors election that is coming up for us after 5 o'clock. So we need a motion to continue, and I think it's just best if we say what items we want to cover in continuing after 5 o'clock.
I would move for public comment.
All right, it's been moved that we stay convened to hear from the public and nothing else. Is there any?
I'll second that.
Okay, there's a motion and a second. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Great. Thank you. Is there any member of the public wishing to comment on items not on today's agenda? Seeing no one coming forward, we are adjourned. We can't even hear from members. Okay. Have a good weekend. See you next month.